Thank you all for coming out, and it is a tremendous honor to be with you in beautiful Florida, and I'm always thrilled when my wife, Susie, can come along. I get a chance to speak around the country, literally hundreds of times a year, do a daily television program called Faith in History, and it airs on DirecTV on the TCT network, and then a radio spot that airs on several hundred stations. Wanted to mention a few of my books before I get started. This is one book called America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations. And it sold over 500,000 copies. It's alphabetical, so Abigail Adams is at the front, and Lincoln, Jefferson, Franklin, William Penn, Booker T. Washington, and so it's all their God and Country quotes, all together in one handy volume. It's alphabetical. And then, since today is St. Pat's Day, I actually did a DVD series on St. Patrick and a book. We don't have the book with us, but if you want to get it, my wife can take your order and we'll get it in the mail this week. But it goes through this history that I'm going to touch on a little bit today, and I think you'll find this fascinating. Tonight and then tomorrow night, I'm speaking on Islam, the 1400-year history of Islamic conquest, and how Egypt used to be Christian until it was invaded by Emir Ibn al-As, the Muslim leader. Syria used to be Christian until it was invaded by Caliph Umar. Turkey used to be Christian until it was invaded by the Muslim Ottoman Turks. There used to be 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa in the 7th century, until they were conquered by the Umayyad Muslims. And then they invaded Spain, held it for 700 years. And so when we learn the history, it brings it into focus what's happening today. That the Muslim fighters think they're following in the footsteps of these early rightly guided caliphs, is what they're called. Anyway, fascinating history. And then today, I'm speaking on a book. It's called Change to Chains. It's the 6,000-year quest for global control. So we're going to talk some big themes, and then we're going to sort of zero in on what's happening today. And hopefully, you can see this screen okay. I'm going to sort of step back here so I can see it as well. But the question I begin the talk with is, what are we looking at here? Well, can't tell. What are we looking at? Still can't tell. What are we looking at? It sort of looks like a nose. Matter of fact, it looks like a girl's nose. Matter of fact, it is a girl. It's my daughter. Now, I could not recognize her until we zoomed out. Sometimes we're so zoomed into the day-to-day politics and headlines that we really don't know what's happening in the world until we click zoom out, zoom out, zoom out. And so we're going to do a brief zooming out, and we're going to look at 6,000 years of recorded human history. Now, there's only 6,000 years of recorded human history because writing was invented around 3,000 or 4,000 BC. Sumerian cuneiform on clay tablets in the Mesopotamian Valley, right? Where they take clay and a stick and they poke it in it, and that was the beginning of writing. And so 3,000 or 4,000 BC, we're around 2080, so 4 and 2, that's 6,000 years of recorded history. Human beings writing down human records. And in a sense, 6,000 years is not that long. It's only 60 people living 100 years each back to back, right? 60 people living 100 years each, you got 6,000 years. So how many of you have met someone who's lived 100 years or close to it, right? And so we look at some history, and I'm going to go through a couple quotes here. Here is Franklin Roosevelt in 1940. He said, 4,000 or 5,000 years of recorded history have proven that mankind has always believed in God in spite of the many aborted attempts to exile God. So he rounds it out to 4,000 or 5,000 years of recorded history. James Wilson signed the Declaration and the Constitution and was put on the Supreme Court by George Washington. He said, after a period of 6,000 years since creation, the United States exhibited to the world the first instance of a nation assembling voluntarily and deciding that system of government under which they and their posterity should live. So he says there's around 6,000 years of history, and he says something really unique happened here. And then Daniel Webster was one of the most famous U.S. senators and secretaries of state. He said, miracles do not cluster, and what has happened once in 6,000 years may not happen again. Hold on to the Constitution, for if the American Constitution should fail, there will be anarchy throughout the world. He thought something special happened right here. And so, we see that it's been a 6,000-year quest to rule the world. What do I mean? Well, during these 6,000 years, we see records of what? Empires rising and empires falling. Empires rising and empires falling. But one thing keeps repeating itself. Power gravitates into the hands of one person. Now, we call this one person by different names. Caesar, Caliph, Chairman, Chieftain, Communist Dictator, Czar, Despot, Dey, Doge, Emir, Emperor, General Secretary, Grand Mughal, Kaiser Khan, King. The name changes, but the function remains the same. One person ends up with life and death power over everyone in their kingdom. And we see the Sargon of Acadia, and Tilgath-Pileser of Assyria, and Alexander the Great, and Montezuma, and Attila the Hun, and Chandragupta in India, and Justinian the Great, and Genghis Khan, and the King Louis the 14th, the Sun King of France, and Kublai Khan, and the Muslim sultans, and all the way through history. And so, it just happens. Power wants to concentrate. It's like the pull of a magnet. It's like the gravitational pull, pulling a satellite back down to Earth. It's like a pecking order, right? And so, Newton's law of gravity, the lesser mass is attracted to the greater mass, right? People are attracted to people who are important. And when they get attracted to them, that important person becomes more important, and more people get attracted to them, right? So if a billionaire walked in this room, we'd all sort of want to go over and say hi to him, right? If a U.S. senator walked in the room, we also want to go over, right? And so it's like the Lord of the Rings, where the movie and Gandalf tells Frodo, always remember, Frodo, the ring is trying to get back to its master. It wants to be found. Power wants to concentrate. I think it goes all the way back to the fall in the garden and selfishness coming into the human DNA and Cain killing Abel. And so you put some babies in a playpen, one of them will take the rattle from the others. And you put some kids on a playground, one of them will be the bully hogging the ball. And you put some natives in the woods, one of them will be the Indian chief, and you put them in an inner city, one of them will be the gang leader. So all a king is, in a sense, is a glorified gang leader. And if you think of it, if you're friends with the king, you are more equal. If you are not friends with the king, you are less equal. And if you're an enemy of the king, you are dead. It's called treason. So for most of world history, equality was how close of an orbit can you get to the king? How close is your family related to the royal family? What type of caste system do we have here? And where do you fit in this hierarchical system? And so it's a spectrum of power, where one side is total government, the other side is no government. Right? So everyone hold up a fist in one hand and say concentrated power. Concentrated power. And then open palm with your fingers apart with the other hand and say separated power. Separated power. And then go back to the fist, concentrated power. Concentrated power. That is world history. For most of world history, power is in the hands of the kings, pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, sultan, czars. Every now and then, a group of people get a very rare opportunity to stretch the rubber band and experiment in ruling themselves without a king. But in times of crises, the rubber band snaps back. And so, we're going to go through some of this history. Now, we will see a theme that keeps repeating itself, that for people to rule themselves without a king, they need something. It's called virtue. Because if not, it's total anarchy. Right? Everybody's their own king. Everybody does what they want. It's just going to be total chaos and anarchy unless the people have internal morals. And so even Ben Franklin said only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. And then the other side of the spectrum, Lord Acton said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So power wants to concentrate. And it's hard to visualize corruption. So when he says power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, it's sort of hard to think of that. But another word that means the same thing is favoritism. So let's say you get to be the king, and you're going to be really fair. And everything's going along fine until you have a sister with a teenage son that gets drunk and he's driving and he hits somebody and kills him. Now he's facing life imprisonment or the death penalty or manslaughter. And your sister comes begging to you and says, you're not going to let my little Johnny get killed. It wasn't his fault. Those other kids talked him into it, blah, blah, blah. What are you tempted to say to your sister? Well, I'll let little Johnny off the hook this time, but don't let it happen again. As soon as you say that, you are the corrupt dictator. you're sending ripples through the kingdom. That if you're the family or a close friend of the king, you get a little special treatment. And if you're not a family or close friend, you don't get it. And if you're an enemy, he's going to be tempted to use the power of his government to shut you up. And so we see that it's inevitable. When power concentrates, there will be favoritism, there will be corruption. Calvin Coolidge said, the history of government on this earth has been almost entirely rule of force held in the hands of a few. Under our Constitution, America committed itself to power in the hands of the people. Well, the default setting is monarchy, and we go through these 6,000 years. 4 to 3,000 is prehistory, Neolithic. They used stones for tools. The first tool that they invented was the plow. 3,000 to 1,200 is the Bronze Age. They made tools and weapons out of bronze and tin. 12 to 600 is called the Ancient Antiquity. This would have been the Egyptians and the Assyrians, and this is called the Iron Age. And then Classical Antiquity, Greeks and Romans. And then the Roman Empire, and then the Middle Ages, rise of Islam, the Renaissance, Age of Discovery, colonial, early modern, and then 1900 to the present is the Industrial Revolution and the modern. So that's it, 6,000 years. Now, I found this fascinating. Secular history says that civilization began in the Mesopotamian Valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Bible says civilization began in the Mesopotamian Valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And we see that the first thing that happened was people had farms, and the first invention was the plow, and then people started hitting each other with it, and then people gravitated together for protection. When people gravitate together, something happens. People begin to compare themselves to each other, and someone ends up being the one that's a little more of a alpha personality who starts telling everybody else what to do, and then you have this person wanting to take control over the rest. You know, like a high school clique, right? If you're friends with the person in charge of the clique, you're on the in, and if not, you're out. And so this turned into kings. And the first cities that the secular books tell us are Uruk, Urbay, Urartu, and they're along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And the Bible says civilization began in that same area. The oldest book ever written in any language is the Epic of Gilgamesh. And he was the king of Uruk. And it is a story about Gilgamesh going on a long journey to meet this old guy who survived a global flood. Calls it a global flood. This old guy had made a boat, covered it with tar and pitch, put animals in it, and afterwards repopulated the world. And this was written 1,000 years before Moses. Matter of fact, there are over 100 ancient civilizations that have flood stories and flood legends in their ancient past. Maybe there was a flood. And so we see that in this Mesopotamian valley, you got Babylon, you got the Elam, which becomes Persia and Assyria and so forth. And they begin to build these buildings, right? These structures. And lo and behold, the Bible talks about the Tower of Babel. And it is concentrated power with Nimrod in charge. And the Jewish commentator Josephus said that Nimrod wanted to build it so high that if God destroyed the world again with a flood, he could survive on top. So it sort of had this defiant, in-your-face attitude. What did the Bible story say the Lord did when he saw this? He came down and confused the languages, and they what? Scattered. So we see the first instance of concentrated power to build this Tower of Babel, defiant against God, and God scattering it and separating the power. But ever since then, there's been this subconscious effort to rebuild the Tower of Babel and rebuild this structure. And we see from Genghis Khan, Attila the Hun, the Roman emperors, and Alexander the Great, just keeps repeating itself. And in that sense, death is a blessing. Think death is a blessing? Yeah, Genghis Khan killed 30 million people from Korea to Hungary. Imagine if he never died. Mao Zedong killed 80 million people in the 1950s. Imagine if he never died. There were 6 million killed during the Napoleonic Wars. Imagine if he never died. Right? And so we see that at least that dictator gets knocked off, and the people get a breather, right, for a generation until it happens again. And so we see the scattering of the nations around the world. And so Egypt had these power concentrated in the hands of the pharaohs, and it's a very hierarchical system. Pharaoh at top, advisors and priests, and so forth, scribes, and then finally the slaves are at the bottom. Go through the Indus Valley in China. China is interesting because it always had emperors, 5,000 years worth. And if you tried to break away, he'd show up with a 100,000-man army and squash you. But Babylon, around 1750, maybe a contemporary of Abraham, Hammurabi has his code, Hammurabi's code. It's laws, but it's a hierarchical system of laws. So if you do a crime against the king, you get killed. A crime against the upper class, you get punished. A crime against the middle class, you get your hand slapped. You do a crime against the slaves, it's okay. And so we see that these kingdoms keep going on. We've got African tribal chieftains, the Olmec civilizations in the Americas. Sennacherib had the largest empire in the world in Assyria. Today, it's called Syria. Did you know that just this month, the ISIS Muslims went into the Museum of Antiquities in Nineveh, Mosul, and the ancient statues of the kings of Assyria were smashed up with sledgehammers? Just this month, that happened. Anyway, so Assyria was the largest empire in the world at that time. Nebuchadnezzar, we're familiar with him, and there's the Ishtar Gate they took from Babylon and put it in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. Persia had the largest empire in the world, Cyrus of Persia, and he controlled from India to Greece. Alexander the Great then had the largest empire in the world, and then you finally had the Roman Empire, right? And the Roman emperor claimed to be divine. And then we got the Mayans, and Attila the Hun conquers all that in one lifetime. I don't have time to go through all these, but I'm building a case for the fact that kings are the norm. And we see Muhammad concentrated power. And he had generals. This is all that was conquered by Muhammad and the rightly guided caliphs, his army. Yemen used to be a Jewish kingdom. Gassanids were Arab Christians. Jerusalem had been a Byzantine Christian city since Constantine. Syria was the first country that was completely Christian, evangelized by the Apostle Paul. Egypt was Christian, evangelized by Mark, that wrote the Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And again, as I mentioned, 250 Catholic dioceses along North Africa. And then the Muslims invaded Spain, and they fought on horseback with scimitar swords. The Europeans were on foot, so they conquered all of Spain. It was the largest empire in the world at the time. And we keep seeing these empires go. There's Charlemagne in Central Europe, and then the Vikings, and finally we come up to more of the modern times. China's still doing dynasties. Genghis Khan, look at this, in one lifetime, conquers from Korea to Hungary, kills 30 million people. One guy, is in charge of it all, right? And his grandson is Kublai Khan in China. And Tamerlane, he kills 17 million people, wipes out Christianity in Central Asia, and he tells his men to come back with a skull in every hand. I mean, these are like the pharaohs pouring human life down a desert sand hole, building cities of the dead. So when there's a king, your life is only of value if you serve the king. And if you don't serve the king, you're of less value. And if you're an enemy of the king, you're dead. It's very hierarchical. Now, we can't forget the Americas. In Peru, the Incan Empire, everyone was an employee of the state. And the state was ruled by a king who claimed to be a delegate of the sun god. And the Ottoman leaders, and King of Spain, France, and Austria, just going through these, but I think you're getting the drift. Russia, 12 time zones, all controlled by one person, Catherine the Great of Russia. And the Japanese emperor claimed to be divine. Here's Louis the 14th, the Sun King. He controlled all this area. And but the most powerful king in world history was the King of England. Did you know that? The King of England controlled 17 million square miles, half a billion people. Australia, New Zealand, Hong Kong, all of India, a quarter of the world's population right there. Countries in Africa, north to south, British Guyana, and Jamaica, and Barbados, and then Canada, right? Then the Americas. And we decided we're going to break away. Now, I can't leave this out. People say, well, we don't have kings anymore. Well, yeah, we do. They're called communist dictators. So every communist country has a dictator, right? Stalin, Pol Pot, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Mao Zedong. And the Communist Party members are the new royalty, right? So they get to live in the nice houses, they get special shops to shop in, they get special status before the courts, and then the people are the peasants. So all communism is monarchy makeover. People, students in school say, well, communism, I thought that was where everybody owned everything equally. Well, let's think a little deeper. Who decides who lives in the nice house and who lives in the dumpy house? Somebody in the government dictates those things. Well, whoever ultimately dictates those things is the dictator. So communism is nothing more than dictatorship. And even Franklin Roosevelt recognized this. He said the Soviet Union is run by a dictatorship as absolute as any other dictatorship in the world. So this whole business of equality is a bunch of nonsense. It's just dictatorship. Harry S. Truman said, dictatorship is founded on the doctrine that the individual amounts to nothing. The state is the only thing that counts. That men, women, and children were put on earth solely for the purpose of serving the state. And so we got two different kinds of government. One is where your political leaders are on top and the people are the servants. And the other is where the people are on top and the political leaders are the servants. And now we begin to see where America fits in. Margaret Thatcher of Britain said the Decalogue, 10 Commandments, are the origin of the sanctity of the individual. You don't get that in any other political creed. It is personal liberty with personal responsibility. So, few instances of people getting a chance to stretch the rubber band. It's really rare in world history. Now, another thing, am I keeping your attention? Is this interesting? Oh, yeah. One thing I kept seeing over and over again in reading through these ancient civilizations is they all had a fascination with the stars. Egyptian astronomers, Persian astronomers, Chinese astronomers. 2, they had buildings to observe the stars. Stonehenge, ziggurats, pyramids. And 3, some king that got to climb up the building and claimed he was the divinely appointed political intermediary between heaven and the people. God appointed me, so I'm in charge and I dispense it. He's God's representative, right? And we see the Babylonian Assyrians, their kings claimed to be king priests. The Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be son of the god Osiris. The Roman emperors, it was a cult of the deified Augustus Caesar. Chinese emperors ruled by having a mandate from heaven. Incan emperors claimed to be delegates of the sun god. Muhammad, prophet of Allah. Indian rajas worshipped as semi-divine. Medieval monarchs Christianized it and called it the divine right of kings. God chose me to be the king, so whatever my will is must be God's will because he put me here. And I could go on through the rest. Now, it's interesting. Do you know the very first nation that we have a record of that attempted to rule itself without a king?
Israel.
Hint, they came out of Egypt around 1500 BC.
Israel.
Israel is the very first instance that we have record of an entire nation being ruled without a king. So when Israel went into the promised land, for those first 400 years, no king. Everyone was equal before the law. And the law said there's no respect of persons in judgment. Rich or poor, everyone is to be treated the same. Male, female, made in the image of the Creator. Lo and behold, this is the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. The very fact you can look around and everybody you see is equal to you. There's no royal family to butter up next to. There's no caste system that you can classify. Everybody's equal. Israel is the beginning of the concept of equality on planet Earth. And now I found this interesting. In Sumeria, those cuneiform characters, when they invented writing, they had 1,500 cuneiform characters. Now, I don't know about you, but memorizing 1,500 anything would be pretty complicated. In Egypt, they had 3,000 hieroglyphic characters. Not only was it hard to learn, only the pharaohs and the scribes were allowed to learn. It was the way of controlling the ignorant masses by keeping them unable to read. Matter of fact, the Egyptian scribes kept it complicated on purpose. It was sort of job security. Like, oh, we need to interpret this. Get the scribe. Oh, yes. I mean, they wanted to keep it complicated. Well, when Moses came down the mountain, he did not just have the law. He had the law in a 22-character alphabet that was so easy to learn, the entire nation became literate. Israel is the first instance of an entirely literate populace where everybody could read. And not only could they read, they were required to read. And so the law was addressed to every individual person. Harry S. Truman said the fundamental basis of this nation's laws was given to Moses on the mountain. If we don't have a proper fundamental moral background, we will finally end up with a totalitarian government which does not believe in rights for anybody except the state. So Israel had no police because everybody was taught the law, everyone enforced the law. Israel had no standing army because every young man was in the army. Israel had no prisons because the law said swift justice at the gates and the city of refuge you could run away to. And Israel had a bureaucracy-free welfare system because when you harvested your field, you had to leave the gleanings for the poor people to pick through. Right? So it took care of the poor. And the people got to choose their own leaders of their tribes. Right? Over 50s and hundreds and thousands, men of truth that fear God and hating covetousness. And anyway, here's Deuteronomy. Moses spake to the children of Israel, how can I myself alone bear your cumbrance? And he says, take you wise men and understanding and known among your tribe, and I'll make them rulers over you. So you pick them, and I'll go ahead and give them authority. The U.S. District Court in 1983 said the Ten Commandments have had immeasurable effect on Anglo-American legal development. A basic background in the Bible is essential to fully appreciate and understand both Western culture and current events. So, anyway, now I found this interesting. Israel was the first nation with private land ownership. How many of you like the idea of owning land? Israel was the first place where people could own land. Remember all those boring chapters in the Bible where they did surveys and lots and divided up the land? This tribe gets from the river to the sea. You know, Caleb's daughter gets off the donkey at her wedding and says, can I have the spring on the other side of the field too? And the dad says, okay. And my mom's name is Tirzah. And the first mention of Tirzah in the Bible is she was the daughter of Zelophehad, this old guy who had no sons. And so they're dividing up the land. The girls go to Moses and say, don't we get land too? Is our dad's name going to be forgotten? Moses said, you get land, just marry someone within your tribe. But this was unheard of. Individual women getting land, individual families getting land, where in Egypt, the Pharaoh controlled it all. Even if you had land in Egypt, you really didn't, because it was conditional of you staying on the nice side of the Pharaoh. You cross him, he'll take your land and your life. Right? Sort of like England, if you do what the king says, he makes you a sir or a knight and gives you a nice estate. And if you don't do what the king says, he takes away the estate and hangs you. So you really don't have it. It's just conditional, right? But in Israel, the land was permanently titled to the families. If they got in a pinch and sold it, every 50 years it came back. This prevented a dictator from getting control of the land and putting the people back into slavery. So Israel's whole system was the world kingdom turned upside down. And now if you can control land, you can accumulate stuff. Cows and sheep and grain. The Bible called that being blessed. Karl Marx called it being a capitalist. You've got capital, you got stuff, you worked hard and saved it. That's why Karl Marx said the theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence, abolition of private property. Right? So you take away the private property, who controls it? Well, the state. Well, who controls the state? Somebody's dictating the stuff, and whoever ultimately dictates it's the dictator. And now Israel. Israel decentralized. Anybody could be raised up in leadership. There was no royal family. Here's Deborah, a woman that gets to be a leader in Israel simply because she's wise, she knows the law, and she sits under a tree and everybody comes to her for judgment. No other place in the world could that happen. You'd have to be the daughter-in-law of the Pharaoh or something in all these other places, but just on her own merits as being a wise woman who knows the Word of God. And so we see that Israel's system lasted until the priests stopped teaching the system. Until the priests stopped teaching the law. And we see that Eli, the high priest, had his own sons sleeping with women in the tabernacle of meeting. And then there's this horrible story of a Levite with a concubine. He's not supposed to have a concubine. He's supposed to have a virgin of his own tribe. But he's got this concubine, this woman he's not even married to. And the house is surrounded by sodomites, and he shoves her out the door. She gets raped all night and killed. And you're saying, oh, this is gross. And then it ends with this line, every man did what was right in his own eyes. Why did everyone do what was right in their own eyes? Because the priests stopped teaching them what was right in the Lord's eyes. So lo and behold, we see that for people to rule themselves without a king, the people need to be taught internal morals. Right? Everyone is born with this selfishness inside. It's like every computer you buy is preloaded with a virus. And you have to immediately take it to a computer geek to have it cleaned up. Every little kid's immediately born with this selfish virus, and you have to take, in Israel, they have to take them to the rabbi computer geeks who would recode every line. Okay, you want to steal, don't steal. You want to lie, don't lie. You want to commit adultery, don't commit adultery. In other words, the law was counter human nature. And it worked as long as the priests taught it. But when the priests stopped teaching the law, every man did what was right in their own eyes, the rubber band snapped back, and they got King Saul. And so we see that we got concentrated power on one side, separated power on the other side, and you need internal morals. But you think of it, internal morals are powerless unless there's a God on top. Now, what do I mean? If it's just rules, don't do this, don't do that, my selfish human nature is going to want to try to get around those rules. But if everyone believes there is a God, He is watching, He wants you to be fair, and He's going to hold you accountable in the next life. Then you're about to steal something, and you say, wait a second, God's watching. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate. And it creates this thing called the conscience. So if everybody is taught there's a God who wants you to be fair, He's watching, He's going to hold you accountable, everybody sort of self-modifies their behavior. But you get rid of the consciousness of God, and this life is all there is, and I can steal and nobody can find out about it, you'd be a fool not to. So the whole system crumbles without God being part of the equation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, anyway, so in Israel's case, they go to the prophet Samuel, and they said, we want to be like all the other countries, we want a king. Samuel cries, and the Lord said, they did not reject you, they rejected me, that I should not reign over them. They get King Saul, and lo and behold, Saul turns around and kills all the priests, except for one that escaped to David, right, Abiathar. And so Yale President Ezra Stiles wrote, the secular welfare of God's ancient people depended upon their virtue, their religion, their observance of that holy covenant which Israel entered into with God. And Harvard President Langdon said, the only government which had a proper claim to a divine establishment was so far from including the idea of a king that it was a high crime for Israel to ask to be like the other nations. And when they were thus gratified, it was rather as a punishment. You want a king? I'll give you a king. You know what he's going to do? He's going to take your best land, give it to his favorites. He's going to take your sons, make them run before his chariots. He's going to take your daughters, make them be cooks. He's going to determine the fate of your kids' lives. And the people said, we don't care, we want him anyway. Anyway, so Israel's experiment ended. And in America, our founding fathers scraped through history for the alternatives to kings. Again, the most powerful king in the planet was the King of England. And America's founders said, we don't like the king idea. You know, you can be friends with him one day, you can be hanging from the gallows the next day. Let's design a system of government that's the opposite of a king. And so they took the power of a king and separated it into 3 branches, separated it federal to state level, then tied up this federal Frankenstein with 10 handcuffs we call the first 10 amendments. All our Constitution is a bunch of hurdles to prevent the rubber band from snapping back into the hands of a king. And how did they do it? They went back through history and looked at the examples. They looked at Israel, where the idea of equality came from, the idea of rights from a creator. I wrote a book called 3 Secular Reasons Why America Should Be Under God. And I debated atheists. And the atheist says, well, I don't want America under God. And so I said, do you like having rights the government cannot take away? Yeah. Then those rights need to come to you from a power higher than the government. That's why the founders said all men are endowed by their creator. And even John F. Kennedy said, the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. Well, if there is no God, the rights come from the generosity of the state. And what the state giveth, the state can take it away. And so if you want rights the government can't take away, there's got to be a source for those rights higher than the government that you can appeal to. The founders said it was the creator. But our founders also looked at Athens and the Roman Republic, and then England with its constitutions, and we're going to look at a couple of those. Now, so Athens. One side of the world is China. It's landlocked. These emperors had a 100,000-man army, and for 5,000 years, nobody was able to break away and set up a republic. And then they got a belief system that's cemented in emperorship. It's called Confucianism. Confucianism teaches order in society. Very hierarchical, and there's the emperor, and you respect him, and you respect the leaders, and you respect everybody so much that you don't dare try to get rid of the emperor and make everybody their own rulers, right? And so the Confucianism cemented in their social structure that was hierarchical. But the other side of the world is the Mediterranean, with oceans and islands and seas and storms and rocks, and it's real hard to have a totalitarian dictatorship with all these variables. And so it's in the Mediterranean that people had their alternative opportunities to experiment in ruling without a king. And we focus on the Greek states, and in particular Athens. Now, Athens in 622 BC had a king named Draco. He had the first written laws, but they were very harsh. It was the death penalty for every other thing, and so they were nicknamed Draconian laws. Right? King Draco, Draconian. And then in 594 BC, Athens gets a king named Solon, S-O-L-O-N, Solon. Solon invented democracy and left town, so they had to do it. Now, in a democracy, everybody every day has to go to the market and talk politics. And if you did not keep up with politics every day in Athens, you were called an idiotus, an idiot. Now, I thought this was interesting. If there is a king and you have an agenda, you got to get in to see the king, right? Let's say there's a Chinese emperor. He'd have 2,000 concubines. He'd have the Mandarin eunuchs that would keep the concubines. And if you wanted to get in to see the emperor, you had to bribe them with money and favors just to get in to pitch your agenda. But in Athens, there was no emperor. It was the people that made the decisions. Well, if you have an agenda, how do you pitch your agenda to an entire city? You get them all together in an amphitheater and you put on plays where you ridicule some points of view and you honor and extol other points of view. So the Greeks had comedies and tragedies. And in the comedies, they would actually, it sounds like, Jay Leno and David Letterman, they're actually naming politicians and making fun of them. And people would leave there saying, I don't want to be like that guy. And then they would honor and extol in the tragedies these virtues and these great big courageous people. And you say, I want to be like that. And people would leave the theater and they would modify their behavior to pitch, to follow whatever agenda was written into the play. So from that time till now, theater is always political in a country where the people make the decisions. Think of your favorite sitcom or movie or show, and there's some character that you like, you identify with, they're cute, they're funny, they're the hero. And as that series goes on, this character begins to make morally compromising decisions. Lie here, cheat there, a little revenge, a little lust, and you find yourself apologizing for him. Saying, yeah, I know James Bond is with women he's not married to, but he's about to save the world. So can we get on with the story? And it minimizes what used to be important to you. And then they usually make the people that hold old traditional values look like simpletons and buffoons and backwards and idiots. And you say, oh, gee, I don't want to be like that. Okay, And you find yourself modifying your behavior based on the theater that's presented that goes all the way back to Athens. Right? And so, they also had something called ethos, logos, and pathos, so I'm going to skip that. Now, Plato lived in Athens in 380 BC. And Plato said that the government would go through 5 stages. And I think you'll find this interesting. He says the first rulers of a city are aristocracy. He called them rulers who are capable. These are people that are lovers of virtue, lovers of truth. They know how to run farms and businesses. They know how to run city governments. They're just responsible guys. They do a good job. The city grows. The second group wants to get involved in politics. Plato called them a timocracy, or lovers of fame, lovers of honor. These are people that maybe they are a Greek actor and everybody knows their name and they get into politics, or a Greek Olympic athlete, right? The Olympics, And they get into politics not because they have experience running anything, but just because they got famous. Maybe like a Hollywood action figure that gets elected governor of California. You think, what did he run before he became governor? Nothing, not even a village. He was just famous, and then he got to be the governor. And so Plato says that because these people love fame, they hate being defamed. So these you can manipulate with public opinion polls. So the first group They're lovers of principle and truth. They're going to do what's right, say whatever you want about them. The second group, they'll put their finger in the wind and they'll bend anyway because they want people to say nice things about them. What does the headline say today? Oh, well, you know. And so Plato says that because these people have no experience running anything, they yield to the human tendency of avarice or selfishness, and they vote just a little money out of the city treasury to pad their retirement, a little money to go to their brother-in-law's construction company, a little money to go to some supporter that can funnel it back into their campaign. Before you know it, it turns into a third category, an oligarchy, a rule of few, an insider clique, where they pass laws that everybody else has to obey, but they exempt themselves. They raise taxes on everybody else except themselves. And once they get everybody's money and taxes, they funnel it back out, import projects and contracts, so forth, to all their supporters. So Plato called them lovers of money. So you go from lovers of principle and truth, lovers of fame and honor, to lovers of money. And then society begins to break into two. That if you're friends with these people that are in power, you get all the favors. Maybe you get waivers for health care or whatever, you know. And if you're not one of their friends, maybe you don't get it, and you might even get audited. And so before you know it, it breaks into the rich and the poor. And what happens is when you get this division between the rich and the poor gets stirred up, and they finally get riled into rioting, and then they throw out the bums and they set up a democracy. And Plato says that a democracy is, at first, the most charming form of government. It's like a bazaar where you can go down and pick any different viewpoint that you want. It's like an embroidery patchwork with lots of different colors. It's great. And the chief characteristic of a democracy is lovers of tolerance. Right? So lovers of fame and honor, lovers of truth and principle, lovers of fame and honor, lovers of money, now it's lovers of tolerance. And they learn to tolerate everybody. And at first it's great. Then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a little bit more off. Till finally they're tolerating open convicts and criminals. People are doing crime in broad daylight, and everybody lets them just walk down the street. And then it says it creeps into the family. And the sons get to be disrespectful to the fathers. And if the father corrects them, the son just shakes his head. And then it creeps into their morality. And Plato says this: the manner of life is that of democrats. Now, I'm using Plato's words because he is describing a democracy. The manner of life is that of democrats, freedom and plainness of speech, and every man does what is right in his own eyes. Where have we seen that before? In Israel, right before it fell. Everybody gives in to their passions and their lusts. And he says the young man passes into freedom and libertinism of useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime, not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. He is part of company with all shame. So now he's just giving in to his passions and lusts, and then it creeps into their handling of finances. And Montesquieu said, when virtue is banished, ambition invades the mind, avarice or selfishness possesses the whole community. A suspension of the laws can proceed only from the corruption of the republic, and the state is certainly undone. So what happens is they say, hey, there's the city treasury sitting there, the money, and it's a democracy. All we got to do is vote, and we can spread the wealth around. So they vote and spread the wealth around. Now the treasury's empty. They say, where can we get more money? The rich people. And they vote to take the money from the rich people. Now there's no rich people left. And now they're used to this easy money, and there's a shortage. Well, don't cut back on what I'm used to getting. Don't cut back on my welfare checks. Don't cut back on my food stamps. Don't cut back on my government contracts. And before you know it, it turns into chaos and anarchy. And then the people begin to say, can't someone come along and fix this mess? And that's the fifth stage. Someone comes along and they're all smiles. They promise everything to everybody. They're very fun, cute and charismatic and eloquent, and they draw these big crowds, and they're very persuasive. And as people fall in love with this person, they yield their rights, their freedoms, their powers. And then he begins to consolidate power. And then people get a little worried. And then he begins to drop in the public opinion polls, and they begin to cast it in his teeth and tell him that you're getting too powerful. And Plato says he has a choice. Give up the power, which he's not inclined to do because he is a lover of power, or get rid of the people that are confronting him. And so he gets rid of anybody that has virtue. He purges his military of anybody that has virtue because he only wants people that'll do his bidding. He purges his administration of anybody that has self-control, so all he has is people that obey him. And then, who does he get to become his new surrounding him because he got rid of his former friends? He frees the slaves, the convicts, the prisoners, the illegal aliens, and he arms them, and they become his mob that he sends around to punish anybody that disagrees with him. Finally, he stands in the chariot of state holding the reins of power, and he is revealed as the tyrant. So Plato said, democracy is a temporary phase. It only works as long as the people have virtue. But when they give up their virtue, they give into their passions and their lusts and their libertinism and their useless and unnecessary pleasures, it turns into chaos, and then they end up surrendering their freedoms to a tyrant. And so, only when people have virtue does it work. When they give up the virtue, it consolidates. Fisher Ames, who wrote the wording for the First Amendment, said, in chaos, and society will submit to rule by the sword. And anyway, I'm going to fast forward for the sake of time. So now Plato says that you're back to a hierarchical system. You're back to a king who's the head of gold, and then the administrators and military are the arms and chest of silver, and then the people and the peasants are the abdomen of bronze. So you're back to a king. And then he says, how's this king going to stay in power? He's going to take the children from the families and indoctrinate them with noble lies. So Plato called this tyrant a philosopher king. When the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of their parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. So this is like, a common core. Right? You take the kids and you indoctrinate them with lies, and the lies help you stay in power. And anyway, Karl Marx said, take away the heritage of a people and they are easily destroyed. And so we see that America's founders drew something from Israel, drew something from Athens, drew something from the Roman Republic, and I'll just share it real briefly. Rome had a king named Tarquin, and his son raped a lady named Lucretia. The rape of Lucretia. Lucretia was so upset that she got all the Roman leaders together and committed suicide right in front of them. The Roman leaders got upset and killed King Tarquin, and they made a rule that if anybody in Rome would ever become king, anybody could kill the person without any repercussions. So for 500 years, nobody in Rome wanted to come anywhere close to being called a king. And so Rome was ruled by senators, 600 of them, SPQR, Senatus Publicus Romanus, and these 600 senators ruled Rome. Now, they, over time, got wealthy, the people got in debt. It was still better than a king, but they get a young guy named Julius Caesar, whose family was bankrupt. He joined the military to escape debt collectors, and then he ended up wanting to become a great general, and he brought back a lot of booty into Rome, gave away a lot of slaves. The people like Caesar because he's giving away free stuff. Caesar wants to get involved in politics. He makes an agreement with two other guys called the Triumvirate with Pompey and Crassus. Pompey was the rich Republican establishment guy, former military hero that conquered in North Africa, Spain, and even the Holy Land. Pompey actually went to Jerusalem, conquered it, and went into the temple, the Holy of Holies, and came out and told his men, don't touch this place. And so the Jews liked Pompey. But then there was Crassus, and he was the richest guy in Rome. He was sort of like the George Soros of the day. And Crassus made his money through fire brigades. Your very nice house would mysteriously catch on fire, and Crassus and his men would be there with buckets of water. And he would offer to buy your house for pennies on the dollar. And the longer you negotiated, the more it burnt, the less he offered. And so he ended up becoming the richest landowner. So this triumvirate. Now Crassus dies in 53 BC, turns into a tug of war between Caesar and Pompey. So Pompey wants to retain the republic. Caesar, though, he's got a different plan. He raids the federal treasury, the Temple of Saturn, where there was 400 years of Roman gold. And he uses this money to buy supporters against Pompey. This is like using stimulus money to buy Acorn and SEIU workers, right? To be able to campaign against your rich Republican type of opponent. So 15,000 bars of gold and silver. Caesar said, use money to get men, use men to get money. Well, once Pompey's out of the picture, does Caesar go to the people and say, hey, you helped me get here, you can help me run Rome? No. He makes himself dictator for life and starts the cult of Julius Caesar. And anyway, Mark Antony is his high priest. And so then finally, after him comes his nephew, and Octavius, and Rome is no longer a republic, it's an empire. Now, we go through England. I don't have time to go through all this. But England began to say, okay, we're going to limit the king by his own words, limit him by traditions, limit him by religion, limit him by public opinion, and then finally limit him by parliaments and constitutions. And then America comes along, and we said, forget it, we're just going to get rid of the king altogether. Did you find this interesting?
Yeah.
And my wife has a, give my seat. All right. Now, do you want to hear one more story about the fall of Rome and St. Patrick?
Sure.
Some of you do?
Yeah.
All right. So Rome was a republic, then it becomes an empire. And it lasts until a couple things happen. China begins to build the Great Wall of China. The Huns can no longer attack into China. They turn west. It starts a domino effect of tribes across Central Asia. These spill across the borders into Rome like illegal immigrants. Right? They're the Ostrogoths and Visigoths and Anglos and Saxons and Jews. They first come across slow and work as servants and learn the Latin language. Then they come so fast they keep their own language. And the German, French, and England, it breaks up the unity of the Roman Empire. And so Rome had to put its military around the world to put out these global fires. And they had to pay for it all. So they had this huge debt. Debt is always a precursor to a civilization collapsing. So they had to raise taxes. One historian said the tax collector was worse than the barbarian. And then the whole city of Rome was on welfare. The emperor didn't want the people in Rome to riot if they found out that the empire's crumbling, so he gives them all free bread, doles of grain. And then he puts on violent entertainment, the circus. Now it's not with clowns, it's the Circus Maximus, where they fight to the death, right? So the people are preoccupied with violent entertainment and free government welfare handout. Whole lot of immorality and violence, big government corruption, and then outsourcing. Rome had outsourced all of its grain production to North Africa. That was the grain basket. And when the Vandals, that was the name of one of the tribes, you know what they did when they went through town? They vandalized. The Vandals came through Spain and captured North Africa and held back the ships of grain. Sort of like we've outsourced everything to China. If they ever held their ships back for 3 months, all of our Walmart shelves would be empty and our economy would grind to a halt. So Rome was brought to its knees economically, and then they began to have terrorist attacks. Attila the Hun. He had an army of 500,000 men, and he would wipe out entire cities. One right there, Aelio, on the Adriatic Sea, he levels the city. The people run out to where the ocean is, and it's sandy and it's flat out, and they hammer logs down. The people live on platforms and go from one to the other on boats with long sticks, and it turns into the city of Venice. Right? So Venice started to try to get away from Attila the Hun. And so Attila wipes out these cities in Europe, but what happens is Rome has to pull its legions back from the frontiers. And so Britain, a Roman colony, was left unprotected, and that's when Patrick is kidnapped and taken and sold as a slave into Ireland. Now, Ireland was ruled by the Druids, where we get Halloween. That's human sacrifice and taking skulls for goblets and shrunken heads, and and they tie people and throw them into bogs, those monkey swamps. And anyway, so Patrick's over there for 6 years, and he ends up remembering his parents' Christian faith. He converts, goes back to Ireland, and when he's 40 years old, he has a dream calling him back to Ireland as a missionary. He goes back and he boldly confronts the Druid chieftains and presents the gospel to them in their own language, which he had learned when he had been a slave. And he ends up baptizing 120,000 people, uses a 3-leaf clover to teach the Trinity. And the next century, it was these 300 Irish churches that Patrick started that sent missionaries back to the Scots and the Picts and to Europe. One Irish missionary named Columbanus started over 100 churches in Europe. And so it sort of went full circle, right? And so the idea is that when all these heathen hordes overran, the Roman Empire fell, and the legions were pulled back, and that's when Patrick was kidnapped to Ireland. He evangelized for 30 years, and then his Irish missionaries evangelized, and then they end up coming back and evangelize those heathen hordes that had overrun the Roman Empire. Why do I throw that story in there? Well, when you're living in a time when your civilization may be crumbling, it can sort of get a little depressing, but we have to remind ourselves that God can still touch one person, and they, in their heart, can decide, you know what, I'm going to do bold stuff for the Lord, and that's what Patrick did, and that's why we remember him today. So, did you get anything out of this today?
Oh, yeah.
Well, now I do want to mention, I do have the DVD on St. Patrick, and my wife, we have a little book table deal where if you buy 2 things, you get a third one free. So it just sort of makes a great time to stock up on some presents. But do I have time for some questions? Or?
Sure.
Did you write all of this?
Yes, and with the help of my wife.
How does this relate to today's politics?
That's sort of the second part of my presentation.
That's what we want to hear.
Can you show them that very end with Hillary and?
Yeah, let me get to that. So,
Your wife's been prompting me then.
so
You have to be in another Tea Party, but that is the best part.
So this is historically, it's the power goes from God to the king, he dispenses it to the people. In America, we said, no, God gives the rights directly to the people, we choose our leaders from amongst ourselves. But we see that after every crisis, there's a reconcentration of power. And so let me get to these different slides here. And
What I'm hearing is history repeats itself.
it does. So I asked the question, who's the king in America? Now you got to think for a second. Well, our founder set it up, says the magistrate is not the king, the people are the king. That was Governor Morris who signed the Constitution. The people are the sovereign of this country. That was John Jay, the first Chief Justice. James K. Polk, the people are the only sovereigns recognized by the Constitution. Gerald Ford, never forget that in America our sovereign is the citizen. The state is a servant of the individual. It must never become an anonymous monstrosity that masters everyone. General Omar Bradley, in the United States, it is the people who are sovereign. The government is theirs to speak their voice and to voice their will. Even Reagan, only by positing sovereignty in the people and not the state can we hope to protect freedom. And so I tell people, imagine you're visiting a king in the Old Testament and you get into his chamber and he's got his head in his hand and he says, do you see all the crime and murders and rapes coming in here? And you're like, yeah. And he says, I wish somebody would fix it. And you like tap him on the shoulder and say, excuse me, you're the king. You're the one that's supposed to fix it. That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the crimes and all the terrible stuff politicians are doing, saying, I wish somebody would come along and fix it. Hello, reach through the TV tube, tap you on the shoulder, you're the king. Our founders set it up so the people are the king. Nobody has to tell the king what to do. It's the people are the king and the politicians are our servants. Anyway. And so, anyway, so here's how George Washington thought the United States would end. In his farewell address, Washington says, usurpation. Now, usurpation is doing something you're not authorized to do, but you get away with it. Usurpation, though in one instance may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. So he says the most dangerous thing is as a leader that says, I want to do something good, just let me usurp a little power. I want to do something good with it. And he says this is how it's destroyed. So it was good that Lincoln ended slavery. But in the process, the federal government usurped some rights away from the states. It was good that Woodrow Wilson wanted to get us through World War I, but he concentrates power with the income tax and the 17th Amendment, where the senators are elected by the people instead of by the state legislatures, where they would want to keep the federal government small. He wanted to get us into the League of Nations, where we would surrender some of our sovereignty. It was good that FDR wanted to get us through the Depression, but he concentrates power with his New Deal programs. And Truman, he wanted to make sure there were no more wars, and so he got us into the UN. And then LBJ, he wanted to end poverty, so he started this Great Society welfare state. He wanted to do something good, but he usurped power, and now we find out that people will always vote for free stuff. I mean, think of it, and I tell people, imagine if you were getting a $1,000 check in the mail every week from someone you didn't know. Week after week after week after week. Would you wake up one day and ask yourself, who is sending me this $1,000 check? I'm going to find out who they are and vote them out of office. Would anybody do that? No. And so this understanding is once you can give away free money and get a whole lot of people to come into the country and immediately sign up for entitlements and money and get as many people out of work as possible so they can sign up for welfare, they will have the strongest human motivation to continue to vote for the candidate in the party that is giving them that free stuff. And so this turned out to be a way to grow a voter base. And so Nixon, he said he wanted to have a war on drugs, but he ended up having the federal government get more powerful. And President Bush wanted to make sure there was no more terrorist attacks, but the federal government ends up usurping power, so now they can track all your credit card purchases and read all your emails and all the stuff. And now the new president. No matter what the crisis is, the answer is let power concentrate. And so, yes, that may solve a problem, but we're changing the form of government from the people being in charge to now it's concentrated into the hands of few and few, and when it's concentrated, you can be guaranteed there's corruption. And so, Washington goes on in his farewell address, disorders and miseries gradually incline the minds of men to seek security in the absolute power of an individual. Remember Athens? Oh, there's a crisis. Can't somebody come along and fix this mess? And he says, this person, this individual come along who turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. And now we go to another example. Machiavelli lived 500 years ago in Italy. Italy was a bunch of city-states. Venice, do you know what, Naples, Florence, Siena? And they always fought. And Machiavelli thought, if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he advocates the ends justifies the means. The end of one prince controlling it all is so good that any means necessary to get there is justified. Lie, cheat, steal. So, if the prince wants to conquer a city, they would hate him. But if the prince pays some criminals to kill cows, burn barns, smash windows, set things on fire, the people would cry out for help. The prince would come in with his militarized police force and kill the very criminals he bribed to commit the crisis, the agent provocateurs, and everybody would praise the prince as a hero. So it's good marketing. You create the need and fill it. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire, and then you go around the front of the house, sell them a fire extinguisher, and they'll pay anything for it. Thank you for being there. So it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control, right? It's concentrated power to separate. And now that influenced another guy named Hegel. Isn't he handsome? Hegel was in Germany, Prussia. And Napoleon conquered through Prussia so easily that afterwards the King Frederick said, we're not going to let that happen again. We have to strengthen the state. So he said the state is God walking on earth. Hegel came up with a theory called dialectics. It's not a diet method, it's a triangle. One corner is a thesis, the opposite is an antithesis or antithesis, and top corner is a synthesis. So you start here, you have the thesis, you create the antithesis, you create a problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer. That's half as bad, right? So you start here, you create a real bad problem, and then everybody's relieved to settle for your answer. That's half as bad. And so Karl Marx applies this to politics. He says you send labor organizers and community organizers into the neighborhoods to create the crises. And once there's blood in the streets and cars being smashed and set on fire, everybody's thankful for the militarized police force to come down and restore order. 45 countries fell to communism this way. And so they would organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, which is the working class against the business owners. Organize the poor against the rich, the blacks against the whites, the Catholics against the Protestants, the Muslims against the Christians, the Hutus against the Tutsis in the Congo and Rwanda. They really don't care who the two sides are. They just want the crises. And when there's blood in the streets, they all surrender their freedoms. And it works best if they're not Christian. Napoleon said, religion is what keeps the poor from murdering the rich. So if you get rid of religion, all you got is human passions, and you can say, you've been wrong, you want what they have, follow me, you'll get it. Anyway, this influenced somebody named Saul Alinsky. Saul Alinsky apprenticed by riding around with Al Capone's hitmen in Chicago, Frank Nitti, and saw how all you had to do was kill a few people, smash a few windows, and the whole neighborhood would submit to the mob and pay extortion protection money. So Saul Alinsky applied this to politics. And Hillary Clinton did her senior thesis at Wellesley College on Saul Alinsky. And our president was a Saul Alinsky community organizer in Chicago. And so Saul Alinsky said the organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizers must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. Stir up that racism. An organizer polarizes the issue and helps lead his forces into conflict. The organizer knows the real action is in reaction to the opposition. The real arena is corrupt and bloody. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent. Fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. There's a problem in Ferguson, let's make it really big. There's a Gulf oil spill, let's make it really big. Right? There's an immigration problem, let's make it really, it's making the problems as big as possible so that the people will say, government, please come in and solve it. And that's when people give up their freedoms. Community organizers must search out controversy and issues rather than avoid them, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. So, what is the politics being played upon us here in America today? It's the intentional stirring up of crises. Why? Because in times of crises, the rubber band snaps back. So if you wanted to be the dictator and everything's fine and dandy, you have to create the crises so people will surrender their freedoms. And it's sort of Proverbs 6, if you read it. 6 things the Lord hates, yea, 7 are an abomination to him. A proud look, a lying tongue, hands swift to shed innocent blood. But the 7th one is, he that soweth discord amongst the brethren. That's the election strategy we see being played out today, that it's all designed to sow discord. And why? Here's Rahm Emanuel, the president's former chief of staff. Never let a good crisis go to waste. It's an opportunity to consolidate power. David Axelrod was the president's campaign manager. He said, in Chicago politics, we have a tradition where you throw a brick through your own campaign office window and then call a press conference to accuse your opponent. You create the crises and then you blame it on the other one, right? So if you're a racist person, you call the other person racist, right? If you tank the economy, you want to blame the rich people. So in other words, you do the damage and you blame the other person. And then the other person has to say, no, I didn't do it, right? And so then you get away with passing it off. It's a brilliant strategy. This was in the Chicago Tribune in 1934. 1934 Chicago Tribune. Plan of action for the U.S. Spend, spend, spend under the guise of recovery. Bust the government, blame the capitalists for the failure, junk the Constitution, and declare a dictatorship. And he says here, it worked in Russia. So this is the idea that you want the country to go in debt, to say, oh, we want to stimulate the economy. No. Nothing to do with stimulating the economy. The idea is to go in debt so that you can bankrupt the country. And then you blame the capitalists, and then you use it as an excuse to declare the Constitution void. Anyway, we used to call this a long time ago a coup d'etat, where a small group of people take control of a country from the inside, and this was the definition. The sudden and illegal seizure of a government, usually instigated by a small group, to depose the established government and replace it with a new ruling body. Infiltration, that's the definition there. Well, Ronald Reagan, coming back home here, he says, here in America, here for the first time in the thousands of years of man's relation to man, the founding fathers established the idea that you and I had within ourselves the God-given right and ability to determine our own destiny. Out of these 6,000 years of human history, we've seen king, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan. Very rare does Israel get a chance to rule itself, but when they give up their virtue, the rubber band snaps back, they got King Saul. Athens had a chance to rule itself with a democracy, but then their morals cratered and they end up getting conquered by Alexander the Great's dad. Rome was a republic for 500 years until Julius Caesar found a way to usurp power and make himself dictator for life. All these satellites that were shot up into space, the gravity eventually pulls it back down. We had the most powerful king in the world, and America broke away from it. We separated power, put it in the hands of the people, separated federal to state level, tapped this federal Frankenstein with 10 handcuffs. But after every crisis, we see this gradual concentrating of power, and then we see this new philosophy that wants to intentionally create crisis to speed it along. Now, I'll end with this thought, that number one, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children. So we want to do the best we can to give our kids and grandkids as much freedom as we had. The second thing is, out of these 6,000 years, the good Lord decided for you to be alive right now. And he has a plan to use you. And what we see, at least in the Bible stories, is God seems to wait till things look hopeless. And then he raises up little nobodies with faith and courage to do big things. And whether it's a 17-year-old David going up against this giant Goliath, or an 80-year-old Moses going out against Pharaoh, the most powerful military ruler of the age, holding out his staff and saying, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. That this is our time, that we get to be on this earth, and the Lord has a plan to use each and every one of us in a great way. God bless you. Thank you so much.